And waiting for my cue. Okay. Hey, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's ForSpace. Thank you for joining us for today's event, A Theological Work Ethic. What you can learn from the Gospels about work with Gabriel Desjardins. Help situate you. We're streaming to YouTube. We're streaming to YouTube, and we are from ForSpace, and we are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Here at ForSpace, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge. We co-create daily activities, examine research questions, things happening across the university. Just to let you know, we are running this event as a live stream Zoom meeting also. So anyone joining us there, you have questions, just pop them into the chat. We'll read them out for you. Those of you here in the space, if you have questions later on, just raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone around so that everyone can hear online. Okay, now to help introduce Gabriel, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Professor and Chair, Theological Studies, André Gagné. Welcome back, André.
Hello, everyone. I'm extremely honored to be here and to present Gabriel Desjardins. This is one of our alumni events, and we have a couple of those every year. And it's fun to have Gabriel, who's been part of the life of theological studies for several years. He's going to talk about himself. I won't give you the entire CV of his entire involvement, but he's been around for quite some time. He defended his thesis in 2021. He's a master's student with me. I had the honor and privilege of being his supervisor. And now he's working at the university secretariat. And I'm sure we're going to enjoy his presentation, talk to us about how his work has been, in a sense, informed by his own training and research in theological studies. So, Gabriel, we're happy to help you, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Gagné, for having me here today. It's an honor and a privilege to share with you all about my career path and how exactly it connects to theology, and to share a bit of the things that I've learned and gained by having studied theology here at Concordia. So this is probably what most people think of when they hear of studying theology in a theological college or something like that. If you study theology, you must want to become a priest, a pastor, or some type of religious worker. I'm not that. I'm an administrator, and I work in the legal offices of the university. And that's probably one of the last things that you would think of when you think about somebody studying theology and what they would do with their career afterwards. Now, this is probably a little bit closer to what we experience here, at least at Concordia, in studying theology. It's certainly what it was like for me. When I began studying here back in 2013. At the time, I worked some odd jobs here and there to work my way through my studies. I worked at restaurants, I worked at the pharmacy down the corner, and one of the jobs that I did as well was in cleaning. I cleaned different office and commercial buildings, including law firms. I was a janitor who studied theology with aims of perhaps one day teaching. Back then, I cleaned legal offices. Today, I work in one. And this evening, I'm gonna tell you how and in what ways my current job is informed by my studies in theology. And more practically, I'm going to show you some things that you could potentially include on your CVs if ever you're searching for a job outside of religious vocations and you happen, like me, to have a degree or two in theology. So I didn't start out studying theology thinking that I would do legal work. That's not why I came to Concordia to study theology. My initial goal was to go into ministry. You see, I came from a very religious background and I was never sure what to study. And back then I led some ministry type groups in my church. We fed the homeless and things like that. And I was encouraged to go and study theology at McGill, to enter the ministry, particularly in the Presbyterian College. Except there was a problem. Growing up, my education was a bit delayed. When I was 16, I was a high school dropout. And then I went and I worked in a warehouse for a couple of years until one day I realized, hey, I don't want to work in a warehouse for the rest of my life. I think I'm going to go back to school. And so I decided at 19 to go back to school, and I finished my high school at age 21. But because of that, I couldn't get into McGill because I didn't go to CEGEP. And McGill required, at least for the Presbyterian College, they required that you have a CEGEP. So the advisor at McGill, what he suggested is go to Concordia, do theology at Concordia, do 1 year there, and then after that year, come back to McGill and we'll enroll you because you'll have some credits and you can come and start studying at McGill. But I applied to Concordia, I got in, but I didn't go back to McGill. Because I ended up loving Concordia so much that I decided to stay and complete my degree here. And now, in fact, I love it so much that I decided to spend the rest of my life here, pretty much. So I also decided at that time to adapt my goal. In that first year of studying theology at Concordia, I realized, okay, you know what, maybe I don't quite want to go into ministry. I think this academia thing is kind of cool. I think I'm going to try that. I'm going to aim for that. I'm going to aim to become a teacher in higher education. So that became my goal. But then one day, while I was a student in theology, Dr. Marie-France Dion, who was the chair at the time, approached me and said that she was looking for someone to sit in as the staff member and do Scott's job, the job that he's doing now. So she offered that to me and to one other student. The other student turned down the offer, and so it was up to me. And I decided to take it because it sounded like a better job than cleaning, you know? Plus, it just so happened that at that time, I had recently completed a course on business writing for my minor in professional writing. And in that course, we had an assignment where we had to make an application towards an imaginary job. So I was looking around online, through job banks and stuff like that, and I saw a job opening at McGill, basically to be an administrative assistant for their Department of Religious Studies. So I decided to use that for my assignment. And when I did that, I thought to myself, hey, this type of work could actually be kind of interesting. You know, maybe that's something that I could do, at least until I start teaching. And I completed that assignment about 2 months before Dr. Dion offered me the job. It was pretty serendipitous. So I worked at Theological Studies for 2 years, all the while continuing my studies. I finished my bachelor, and then I started my master's, and still planning to one day teach. That is, until one day, while I was working in the department, I realized how scarce the teaching jobs in theology actually are. At one point, while working in the department, we had to hire an LTA, or a limited term appointment instructor. And they are hired on yearly contracts for a pretty small amount, a pretty small salary. And we must have had about 30 or 40 people applying for that job. And one candidate who made it very far in the interview process was actually willing to move his entire family over to Montreal for a job from another country, for a job that again was only guaranteed for 1 year and paid a fairly small amount for a university instructor. So seeing that, I realized the importance of developing a potential career in academic administration, even if it was just a backup career or a plan B. So my path adapted, again, to focus on academic and then, as we'll see, later legal administration. So this is what my career has looked like since that time. If you go on my LinkedIn, that's pretty much what you'll see. So after 2 years of working in theology, I left the department and I applied for other positions. I was lucky to find another job at Concordia. I was really adamant on working at Concordia. So the other job was in fine arts in the Department of Studio Arts. And it took me about 30 CVs. I had sent about 30 CVs to different jobs because I really wanted to work at Concordia. I loved Concordia. And I interviewed for several positions as well. And then I found that job in Studio Arts. And at Studio Arts, I found a great mentor in my boss, who was the department administrator, basically the manager of the administration for that department. He trained me in order to become an administrator myself, and together we brought the department through the COVID pandemic, bringing a lot of the courses online, which I'm sure you can appreciate is quite a challenge when you're talking about art classes. So we did that, and then we also redesigned the administrative org chart of the department, recreating certain positions, including my own. I started out as the department assistant, but we changed the role to administrative services coordinator and even managed to obtain a salary increase due to the change in scope for that position. I then saw an interesting job posting after a couple of years of, or almost 3 years working in studio arts. I saw an interesting job posting at Concordia in the university secretariat, where the legal offices are. The job was a coordinator position that was also a supervisory role. And supervisory roles are very hard to come by, especially for those working in administrative assistant positions. It can be quite difficult to make that leap from assistant to manager, since many manager positions require supervisory experience. And what made the position in the secretariat unique is that it did not require supervisory experience, but it provided it. It gave you, part of the role was to be a supervisor, even if that experience was not required. So seeing that valuable supervisory experience, I applied for the job and I got it. It was a significant jump for me and put me on a path to advancing my career. It gave me the opportunity to work closely with some of the senior administration of the university, and I gained experience in corporate governance, or the administration of the governing bodies of corporations associated with Concordia, such as eConcordia Knowledge One and the Concordia University Foundation. I also gained exposure to knowing and studying corporate bylaws and doing legal work. And I remember last year, it kind of dawned on me that I had made it quite far, because we had a very important meeting for the foundation that was held in the Fasken Dumoulin high-rise building in very nice law firm offices. And then I realized, wow, I'm working here now. I used to clean these types of rooms. So at first, my objective was to become a department administrator, like my previous boss in studio arts. And then perhaps from there, maybe to become a director of administration. So that's the role for administrators who are in charge of entire faculties. They manage the administration for the entire faculties. So the administrators usually report to the directors of administration. And I figured that could be a good place to retire from. But then last year, there was an opening for the position of the person whose office was next to mine, the role of officer, access and privacy. And I decided to apply and put forward all the skills I obtained in both my work, career, and my education in theology. I decided to put my best foot forward and to see what would happen. And it turned out that my profile was exactly what they were looking for. And here's how. The primary responsibility of the Officer Access and Privacy is to process and review freedom of information requests, which are essentially requests made by members of the public to public institutions regarding documents held by those public institutions. And the documents can concern the person's own personal information, or they can be administrative documents held by the institution. The purpose of freedom of information laws is to promote transparency for public institutions, since they're publicly funded. The other component of the role is to help administer the privacy requirements of the university, or to ensure that our practices are sound when it comes to the protection of personal information. And then there are a whole host of tasks associated with that. The law on which freedom of information and the protection of personal information is based is known as the Act Respecting Access to Documents Held by Public Bodies and the Protection of Personal Information. For this role, critical and analytical thinking are required in order to analyze the requests and to determine whether exceptions can be applied based on the law. Essentially, there are certain exceptions in the law where we can redact certain elements of documents or refuse all or part of a request based on those exceptions. And some of those exceptions are mandatory, others are discretionary. The role also requires a lot of research. I had to be familiar with the law mentioned earlier, along with several other related laws referenced in the Access Act, as well as regulations produced by the government and the associated case law and jurisprudence. In order to understand the exceptions in the law, it's vital to see how decisions were applied by the Commission d'Accès à l'Information, which is the governing body that oversees freedom of information and privacy in Quebec. Ethical deliberation is also part of the job. I'm constantly faced with situations where I need to weigh several factors in order to make a judgment call. And writing and presenting are also core components of the work. Writing is required to draft response letters for those freedom of information requests, along with creating guides and protocols surrounding privacy and other documents to help sensitize the Concordia community to our obligations under the law. And then along with that, along with sensitizing the community, you also have to have some skills in presenting, in training, in teaching. And thankfully, coming to Concordia and doing a master's here, I was given opportunities to teach courses, give presentations, so that really helped me to foster those skills. And lastly, the job requires being organized and efficient in order to handle the high volume of requests and obligations. So how exactly does theology fit in with my work? I mean, maybe the gears are starting to run already after what I just presented, like what are the competencies of the job, but we're going to go into everything bit by bit. So first of all, a humanities graduate degree provides you with an opportunity to develop long-form reflection and argumentation, particularly while researching and writing a master's thesis. Along with that research is the capacity to learn and master a subject. You learn what it takes to know a subject well enough to develop a long-form argument about that subject. You also have the opportunity to present and defend your research in the presence of experts. And lastly, this process of researching and developing a thesis, mastering a subject, and defending your research instills critical and analytical thinking, or the ability to engage with the subject matter and make value judgments based on your research and knowledge. Most of these skills are applicable at the undergraduate level as well, although on a smaller scale. Now, specific to a theology degree, one learns hermeneutics and the ability to decipher different meanings from different interpretations. The fact that different readings are possible when reading the Bible teaches the theology student the value of interpretation and of attempting to uncover the author's original meaning. This is particularly valuable within the context of legal work, where lawyers make interpretations of the law and judgments pronounced in court cases while appealing to certain laws. Now, as a little side comment, I also recognize the impact on my career of my upbringing as an evangelical, where entire theologies are based on whether an interpretation of the Bible can be proven within the text. This exercise of delving into the scriptures in order to bolster your convictions or disprove those of another person is essentially what's done in law. We look at the law and we interpret the law based on how courts have settled cases in the past or based on readings by legal experts. Suffice it to say, interpretation is a vital practice in many fields. It's a vital skill, making a comprehension of its complexity an important valued skill. And it's a skill that we learn very well in theological studies, especially in a non-confessional department of theological studies, where no overriding doctrine dictates how we can and cannot interpret the Bible or other religious texts. Next is ethical decision-making. Christine Jameson's ethics classes in particular help foster this skill, which is useful in many workplace settings, including legal work. Another valuable asset of a theology degree is theological and intellectual humility. As an evangelical, I had to learn the hard way, the very hard way, that my interpretation is but one interpretation amidst countless readings and beliefs. I had to learn to remain humble and ready to accept that I may be wrong. This humility is a valuable skill in virtually any field. The willingness to accept that one might be wrong and the courage to admit it, to accept the truth and move forward. Last, but definitely not least, is the fostering of values. Even an atheist can read the Bible and admit the value of the golden rule. And loving one's neighbor as oneself is only one value that the Bible helps instill. The Bible teaches us to be kind, even to our enemies, to be truthful, to be courageous, to act wisely, to be a good steward of the things and people in our care, to exercise self-control, to be generous, to show compassion and forgiveness, to be patient, honest, and to persevere, all of which are more than valuable in the workplace. Virtually every employer wants employees who demonstrate these and other values that are gained from reading and studying the Bible and its related texts. Now, I'm going to talk more about this particular aspect in a couple of slides, because I think it's perhaps the most valuable thing about a theology degree. For now, take note of this slide. Take a picture of it, or I don't know if the slides will be sent to you after, whatever you need to do to remember it, because a lot of these skills can be added to your cover letters and CVs, and they're highly valuable to employers. It's all about how you present it. If you just say, I have a theology degree, you might get skipped over. But if you explain what you've gained from that theology degree, if you explain those transferable skills and what you can do with them, that makes you valuable. Now, I hope with my last slide that I've convinced you of the value of a theology degree for the workplace. However, despite this, I highly encourage anyone pursuing a theology degree to do a minor or a double major. While completing my bachelor's in theology, I also did a minor in professional writing, and that minor has helped me tremendously in my career. In studio arts, I became known as the proofreading guy, because everyone knew that I could write and edit texts very well. And since I've started my new role, I've also completed a certificate in access to information and privacy through the Université de Montréal. You could also consider doing a minor in other fields like business or other career-oriented disciplines. Another option is to take continuing education courses or certificates offered here at Concordia or at other universities. You could also do a double major in whatever discipline that interests you, or you could pursue a different discipline at the graduate level, whether for a master's or a PhD. The skills I've described here are highly valuable, as I mentioned. But having that extra minor, double major, or continuing education degree can go a long way in having your CV noticed by recruiters and hiring managers. Okay, let's get back to values, specifically in relation to the Gospels and Jesus' parables. The first parable I want to speak of is the parable of the talents, minas, which is probably the most obvious of them all. In fact, I'm sure most of you thought of this parable straight away when I said I would speak about Jesus' parables. Here, Jesus tells a parable of a master who was going away on a journey, but before he left, he entrusted his servants with his property and wealth. To one servant, he entrusted 5 talents. To another, he entrusted 2. And to a third, he entrusted 1 talent, each entrusted according to their abilities. When he returned, the master found out that the servant who was given 5 talents had gone out and made 5 more. And likewise, the servant who was given 2 talents had gone out and made 2 more. However, the servant who was given 1 talent went and hid it away. He did not produce anything with what he had been given. When the master returned, he was upset with his servant and threw him out, giving his 1 talent to the servant who had 10. In every single work setting of my life, this parable has played in the back of my mind, being ever present in my work ethic. Do something with what you've been given. Work hard and make something with the little you've been entrusted with, and you will likely be entrusted with more. Be faithful with even the small tasks, with even cleaning toilets and lawyers' offices, and you will one day be noticed even in the small things you do. Another parable told by Jesus is that of the seat of honor, where a man at a wedding feast seats himself at the seat of honor only to be humiliated when asked to move to a lower seat. There are many areas where pride has its place, but humility is the better approach in many settings, and that is absolutely applicable in the workplace. Let yourself be honored by your peers and superiors, because humility can lead to being honored, whereas in many settings, pride can lead to humiliation. A third parable that I want to highlight is that of the 2 sons who were asked by their father to work in a vineyard. The first son says he won't go do the work in the vineyard, but later changes his mind. The second son tells his father that he will work in the vineyard, except he never actually does the work. Now, contextually, it's important to note that this parable is told in the context of tax collectors and sinners who at first refused to do the work of God, but later accepted, in comparison with the Sadducees and Pharisees who say they will do the work of God, but never actually do it. Regardless, there's a lot that we can learn and unpack from this parable. And very simply put, this parable demonstrates that actions speak louder than words. The work you do is much more meaningful than the work you say you will do. The Gospels also foster values through the character of Christ. through his washing of the disciples' feet as a demonstration of leadership and humility. Despite being the Son of God, he lowered himself to wash the feet of his followers. Jesus was also compassionate to those in need. He resolutely determined to accomplish the will of the Father. He showed integrity in the desert despite temptation, and he remained resilient in the Garden of Gethsemane. And these are only a few things that we can learn from the Gospels in terms of fostering values that are applicable all throughout life. Beyond the Gospels, the Bible is full of examples that we can learn from and follow. You don't need to be a believer to be moved by Joseph's perseverance and integrity despite being sold into slavery by his own brothers and then later thrown into prison after being falsely accused by his master's wife. All the while, whether a slave in Potiphar's house, a captive in prison, or the second in command to Pharaoh, Joseph worked diligently to the best of his ability regardless of his circumstances. That is an example to strive for. We can also learn from Job's trust and steadfastness, Ruth's loyalty and diligence, Daniel's courage and strength, Paul's determination to spread the gospel, David's humility and bravery, and Mary's faith and obedience, among many, many other examples. Sure, there's a lot of horrible and questionable things in the Bible, but there's no doubt that the Bible is also a text with stories that can form character and foster values, which is something that very few disciplines in academia can provide. And then beyond that, learning the Bible and theology from a secular institution, and especially an institution where that's non-confessional, that also increases your ability to sift through what you don't need to carry into your life, but to know, okay, this is a good story. This is something that I can really learn from. This is something that can teach me something. So coming to Concordia helps to foster that, helps you to chew the meat and spit out the bones. Okay, so what should you take away from this presentation? First, be open to opportunities that come your way. See where they lead. Be open to the unexpected. Next, have a career backup and be willing to adapt your goals. Third, demonstrate the value of a theology degree to future employers in cover letters and interviews. Describe those transferable skills and relate your degree to the job, the specific job that you're applying for. Supplement your degree with minors, certificates, double majors, and alternate graduate programs. And lastly, live out the values gained from the Bible. Again, that's the best thing that you stand to gain from a theology degree. Values will last you for your whole life and are applicable to every area, not just the workplace. Thank you all for attending, and thank you again, Dr. Gagné. Happy to answer.
Wow, can't make it clearer. Very, very practical information. And I've seen your journey personally. I've witnessed this, and it's a phenomenal life that you've been living since you've discovered your path. And thank you so much, Gabriel, for this inspiring talk and giving us really pointers on how theology can inform a life that is outside, in a sense, of theology. So we have time for discussion, questions. Maybe there's people online also. So we'll just open it up. I think there should be maybe a mic around. Yes?
I've got one. I'll just,
okay.
People joining us on Zoom, if you have questions, just pop them into the chat. We can read them out. You also could turn on your mic and ask it. But yeah, and people here in the space, I'll just bring a microphone over to you.
So questions. Yes, Gabriel.
So a question that I have is in terms of competition with the degrees. So for example, if someone in theological studies desires to work in a business position, but then you have someone with a business related degree as your competition, then what then would be the situation to give the person in theology the advantage, do you think?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. I would say certainly by supplementing your degree with a minor, another bachelor, or something along those lines, I think, or even certificates. Like, for example, last year I had started doing a certificate in human resource management because that's what I was going to also include on my CV. And you definitely want to include both. And when you're applying for a job, don't just send your CV, write a cover letter. Now, sure, not all employers read cover letters, but I can tell you that the workplaces that are worth working at, they're gonna look at the cover letters because they wanna really get an understanding of these employees to make sure that they're gonna fit with the work culture. So in your cover letter, that's where you have an opportunity to show them that your theology degree is not just something for ministers and pastors and people in religious vocations, that there are real concrete transferable skills that you bring to the workplace. And then if you do get offered an interview, then that gives you another opportunity to also demonstrate the value of your theology degree. So that's why I would say have another bachelor, have a minor, because that helps you get your foot in the door. And then once your foot's in the door, explain everything else that makes a theology degree so valuable.
That's good to know. And would that also include like certificates achieved from grad pro skills as well?
Well, they have, I think, I couldn't tell you like what weight that would have. Like it definitely doesn't give you, I don't think it gives you university credit from my understanding. But if you do like a certificate through Concordia Continuing Education, that really does give you university like credits, and you get like an actual diploma, a certificate, and everything. So I would say that that is more valuable. I mean, you could mention in your CV that you've done these grad pro skills courses. I think that you could mention that. But doing a continuing education certificate would have more, and diploma has more weight, I would say.
All right, that's good to know.
It's my thing.
Yeah, I was wondering, theology being a subject with so many niche sub-branches, did you learn anything from your studies about obtaining hard-to-access information that serves you in your job today?
Hard-to-access information. Okay, well, so I'll explain the way the job works a little bit. So we get requests, right? It comes to me, and then I'll usually meet with the lawyers, and we look it over, and we try to figure out where are these documents held in the university, right? Because it's a huge university, and so we have to figure out who holds the documents. We contact them, we give them the deadlines, because there are legal deadlines that we have to respect. We have to give a response by 20 days, and then we can add an additional 10 days if we want to. So the way that theology helps me is first in reading those requests, in interpreting them, because we really have to get granular in reading the requests, because we're only going to provide documents to those requests. And then the other thing too is in reading the law, theology has also helped me, because it informs me on how to interpret a text, because I'm telling you, sometimes the legal texts are more convoluted than anything in the Bible at all, right? So having gained those skills by studying theology helps me tremendously when I'm having to read and interpret the law. I don't know if that answers the question you were going for, but yeah.
Great,
okay.
Thank you.
Just to surf on Timothy's question, some of your research, when you did your work on in the MA and some of the master's courses that you took, even at the undergrad level, you had to do exegesis, for example. You had to do very, very refined analysis using language, philology, things like that. This kind of attention to detail was almost like, biblical scholars are often obsessive with that. Would you say, up to a certain extent, that helps? This is one aspect of theology that is very niche, like biblical studies, where you need languages, you need certain types of skills. It's not that the other fields don't have or necessitate other skills, but in biblical studies, there's people that don't go in biblical studies because they have to learn ancient Greek and Hebrew and sometimes Latin and other ancient languages. Would you say that you've learned these things? So would you say that helped in a sense, or that attention to detail, that training, that precision that requires engagement in that kind of work in biblical exegesis helps?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because everything that I learned in the exegesis, learning Hebrew, learning Greek, going to the original languages, trying to get as close as possible to the author's original intent. Yes, it did instill those skills of being extremely detail-oriented. And for this job, and even my previous job, you have to be extremely detail-oriented. Before, I used to have to interpret the bylaws of the corporations, and the corporations have to follow their bylaws exactly, right? And sometimes you would see, okay, a practice is not necessarily following the bylaws. So you have to go and do a deep dive into the bylaws and try to understand what is this corporation supposed to be doing so that you could bring it into alignment with their bylaws. And then along with that, sometimes you would have to delve into the corporate history to understand, okay, why was this bylaw written? Why was it written the way it was? Because you have to explain that to the corporation so that they understand, okay, oh yes, this is the reason why we have to do this, and this is how we deviated from our bylaws. And then in my current job, so for example, there's a new law coming out for health information that's going to be coming into effect in a few short months. And in the Access Act that I was mentioning earlier, there's something called privacy impact assessments. And those are carried out whenever we're purchasing a software or a tool that uses, stores, communicates personal information. And so there's some instructions on what we need to do there, and then we have to enter an agreement with corporations after a successful completion of a privacy impact assessment. The Personal Health Information Act also has privacy impact assessments and agreements, but they're very different, and the procedures are very different. But the way that the laws are written are kind of convoluted, so you have to really go into very, very minute detail comparing both, and then you make a report and you bring that to the lawyers so that we can make a decision on how we're going to proceed. And then another thing I'd add too is that given that we live in Quebec, like the laws are written in French, right? Oftentimes I'm reading English translations. I do have one, we call it the binder. It's 3 sets of binders that are this big, I kid you not. And it's all the jurisprudence related to that one law. That one law. It's like 3 Bibles, basically, where it has all the case law and then the lawyer's interpretation of that case law and everything. And currently, the binder is only accessible in French. It's not online. It's only in the paper copy that we have. And so that, I'm always going to the French, but when I go to the law, often I'm reading an English translation. And we have noticed times where, oh, there's a bad translation here, and so we have to go to the original language, the French, right? And see what does this mean? So one example is that there's one article in there where they talk about an exception that we can apply if there's been in the English says a study, right? And so we're like, oh, study, like I guess like a research study or something. But that was a bad translation to the French. The French actually is an analyse, an analysis. So that actually broadens things. It's like, oh no, it's not just like a research study. It's more than that. So for sure, theology has instilled that instinct, right? To want to know, okay, what does the original language say? What were the courts trying to get to? And then also with the freedom of information requests, what is this person actually requesting? What do they want? Why are they asking for these documents? What's the purpose behind that? So for sure.
Incredible. Other comments, questions? Yes. Just pass the mic.
Thank you for the talk. Very informative. I have a more personal question, if you don't mind. If you could go into detail, what made you want to study ministry besides growing up in a religious household, and what made you turn away from that study?
Okay, wow. So when I dropped out of high school, I had a bit of a crisis of faith, as you could say. I stopped believing in God for a little while, and then when I went back to school, I started engaging in my faith again and going to church and things like that, and I started really getting involved in the church and in the community. And I mentioned that I was involved with some ministry type groups, feeding the homeless and stuff like that. And I seemed to like gravitate towards more of like a leadership role in those groups. And so because of that, I guess kind of feeling like a leader in those groups made me feel like, oh, well, if I'm in church settings and I'm taking this leader type position, maybe I should be a pastor. You know, that's where it went to. But then coming to study theology at Concordia, I suppose you could say I had another crisis of faith, right? Because in evangelicalism, there's the notion of biblical inerrancy, right? That the Bible has no problems in it, there's no errors in it. And so coming to theology, I really had to deconstruct that idea. And because it was so crucial to my faith, I guess for a while, I was questioning, I was in crisis. And then I decided, you know what, this ministry thing, that's actually not what I wanted to aim for.
Other questions, comments? Yes. Christopher.
Yeah, so very good presentation. My question actually goes a little bit outside of your presentation, it goes beyond, right? So it's fantastic that you found, a path, career path with theology and that you were able to, find employment and a job and that such. But how do you believe we can create more awareness to have many Gabriel Desjardins, push the envelope that, the humanities can indeed, lead to other job opportunities or even to start your own business revolving around theology and that kind of thing. So what tips or suggestions do you have from your mind to create more awareness about this kind of pursuit?
So I guess there's multiple ways that I can answer that. The first way that I would say is that it starts with each of us, right? Like as a theology student, if your aim is not to teach theology, if your aim is not to go into ministry, which for many people coming to theology, that's what they want to do, right? But if you're coming to theology and let's say you have a similar path to mine and you end up deciding that you don't want to teach and you don't want to go into ministry, but you have this degree, then I think one way to bring about this change of perception is in your cover letters and in your CVs to demonstrate that there are transferable skills and to then get that job. Because if you get those jobs and then you're meeting with your colleagues and they're like, oh, what did you study? Oh, theology. And they're like, what? And then it gives you an opportunity to explain to them, oh, well, these are some of the transferable skills. This is how it relates. I've done that in my job interview. I do that with my colleagues quite often. I explain like, oh, well, because I've done exegesis. And oh, what's exegesis? I explain that. And then they're like, oh, yeah, like I can definitely see a relation there. So that's one thing. But as a theology department, I think that's where the real challenge lies. But I think the things that Dr. Gagné and the department are doing, I think they're working. I do work in the upper administration. I've heard things, and I think that what theology is doing works. Like it is working, and theology just has to keep paving the way forward, doing events like this so that people can hear that. Oh, well, you know what? You can do something different with your theology degree.
Thanks.
Very good question. It's all good questions, by the way. But just to add to what you were saying, Gabe, which is important, there's a program at Concordia, Humanities Plus, that actually does help departments and programs really identify what you've been doing, what you've shown. You could have given a Humanities Plus course, essentially, because that's exactly the outcome. And as departments, especially in the humanities, I think, like you said, I think we need to show through our courses what students can learn as competencies, not just content. They do learn content. We give them a lot of information about theology, but what can they do or what can they gain? What types of skills, like you said, they can acquire while doing this kind of degree and how that is transferable, essentially. Dr. Jameson.
So thanks, Gabe, for your talk. I'm really impressed with it. And I was very struck. One of the things that struck me the most in listening to you, certainly there's the skills that are really clear, that came across very clearly, and the underlying values that kind of guided you. But I guess what struck me the most is your confidence. And I'm wondering if you think your degree or your studies, like, were you always confident, or did this build up in you? Would you say your education kind of instilled more confidence in you, this kind of inner sort of willingness to put yourself out there? Because I think that's so important in finding something, a career in whatever you do, is that ability to kind of put yourself out and express. Certainly the way you express yourself is excellent also. So I'm just wondering if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. My degree in theology did help me instill that confidence. I remember in my first semester, I was terrified to raise my hand and ask a question in higher education, because I was a high school dropout. What did I know? Like, how could I ask a question? How could I make a statement in higher education, And I remember sometimes being so terrified of just going up to the professor to ask a question, or sometimes having a meeting with the professor and being nervous, like on my way to that meeting and things like that. So I started out with having low confidence, I would say, but every time I raised my hand and I was like, okay, I'm gonna try, even though I'm terrified, I don't feel good about asking a question, but I'm gonna ask a question. Every time I did that, that helped to instill that confidence even further. And then, working my way through my bachelor, doing my master's, having to present in front of people, giving academic presentations. I remember the first time I did an academic presentation was for a conference run by Matthew Anderson. I was so nervous and I was stumbling in my words and everything, and I thought I did terrible. I was like, oh, I can't do this. This is awful, But every time I did those things, it made me believe in myself more and more that, okay, I did that. I can do it again. I can raise my hand again. I can give another presentation. I can talk to people. I can do this. And then the same thing with work as well, applying to those assistant administration positions. I was also very nervous with that. And then, climbing higher and applying to different jobs, it was the same thing. Okay, I did it before. I can do it again. So yes, absolutely. My degree did help me with that.
Thanks.
Other questions? We have time. Oh, Gabriel to Gabriel.
From one Gabriel to another.
Yes, indeed. So, in your experience with your job, what would you say you've experienced in terms of some people maybe when they would hear you say that you studied theology, did you notice that they may have had misconceptions about what you've studied?
Well, usually, it's quite surprising, but usually when people hear that I've studied theology, there's more interest. They're like, oh, really? Like, why? Like, what did you study theology for? And oh, tell me more about it. Like, what was your master's thesis and things like that. I can't think of an example of somebody who outright was like, oh, like that doesn't make sense. I think generally people are nice, right? Like they're not gonna like mock you for the degree that you have. And a lot of people are curious and they're interested. They want to know why, And in both of my job interviews, I've had that question. Like they would say, okay, I see you've studied theology. Like how does that relate to this work, And why aren't you trying to go into teaching or something like that? Like, what are you going to do with your degree? So I've had to answer those questions, both in my job as the coordinator of administration in the university secretariat, and then also for officer access and privacy. And in one of the job interviews, my current boss now, who was interviewing me, she said, oh, you're going to be reading a lot of very dry texts, And I said, yeah. Have you ever heard of the Bible? Like, have you ever heard of Leviticus or Numbers or, So yeah, I think that people are often more curious about your degree rather than seeing it as a moment to downplay it or something like that, or question it. Yeah.
All right, that's good. And I also wonder too, like when we consider other degrees that have similar transferable skills, does it then just come down to the cover letter again and the way that one expresses the way those skills are transferable?
I think that's a big part of it. I think that all the disciplines still do have their own thing that they can put forward. And again, I think for theology, and there's probably some other ones too that do the same, maybe philosophy to a certain degree, is the instilling of values, right? Because when you get the job somewhere, if you live out those values, that's going to be noticed. They're going to notice that. They're going to be like, hey, this person, like he's working hard, he's demonstrating this and that and that. That's going to be noticed. So I think that that's the thing that makes theology stand out. Yes, there's a bunch of transferable skills that are very valuable and applicable in many work settings, but the thing that makes it stand out and the thing that even outlives your career are those values. You do a business degree, you're not necessarily going to gain all those.
I understand what you mean. Thank you very much.
Gabriel, maybe to add to the question that was asked before about, your journey. You did your master's, and I think it would be nice for people to know what you did your master's on. What had triggered that? Part of your past also, I think, played a role in the type of questions that you brought to your own research. Could you say, are you comfortable in saying a few words about that?
Absolutely. So at the bachelor's, talking about academic research, at the bachelor's I also did an honors. So I had to write an honors paper and do honors research, and Dr. Truchescu was actually my honors supervisor. And I did it. It was an honor. Oh, thank you. It was an honor for me too. So the question that formed that research was I wanted to go into the history of fundamentalism, right? Because starting to question my beliefs and whatnot around inerrancy, I started to want to know more about, like, where did that idea come from? Where did inerrancy come from? And then I found the fundamentalist movement in North American evangelicalism. So I wanted to study the historical development of that, but also I was interested in that very term, fundamentalism, because while looking at the history, I noticed that the term was used not in a pejorative sense, and that term does have pejorative connotations, right? If you're a fundamentalist, that's not a good thing, right? Whereas when the term was first coined, it was a good thing. It was a rallying cry. Like, they were like, yes, we're fundamentalists. We're going back to the foundation. Like, yes, yes. And so I was curious about, like, when did that transformation happen? Like, how did that term go from being this rallying cry to a pejorative term? And my honors thesis, I published it with McGill, actually, with their religious studies paper. So you can find, actually, I think I have it linked in my CV, in my LinkedIn. So that was what I did at the undergraduate level. And then to take that further, I really wanted to look at the idea of biblical inerrancy. And I was curious to know people who engage that belief in dialogue, people who critique it, are they successful? Like, what are the successful arguments to get people to start questioning things? And all of that is related to my own journey, right? Like, I wanted to know, like, where did I come from? Why was I raised as a fundamentalist? Where did that tradition come from? Why did I change my mind? Why did coming to study theology change my mind and get me to start questioning things? So then that really became the basis of my master's research. And then more recently, I had the privilege to write a chapter on the history of the Department of Theology to celebrate Concordia's 50th anniversary. That's coming out in a couple weeks, I think. And the question that really motivated me for that work was, what makes theology at Concordia so special that it created an environment where I could question what I believed and then change what I believed. And from that research, I think at its core, the Department of Theological Studies, even in that term, theological studies, is a very ecumenical and non-confessional department, and it really exposes students of theology to different theologies, right? You're not just learning evangelical theology, you're not just learning Catholic theology or whatever, you're learning theologies. And because of that, because you're exposed to the different voices in theology, all those voices are speaking a language that you know, as an evangelical, for example. It's a language you know, but because they're speaking in their own voices, they're saying words you haven't heard before. And because they're words you haven't heard before, it enables you to question how you've understood your own background.
Great. Anybody? Oh, in the chat. There's 2 people in the chat.
How do we see the chat?
Maybe there's a question or 2. Just at the bottom. I don't know if someone can... Are you able to look at the chat? Or?
Okay, so...
Oh. No message?
Oh, we can read it out loud for you.
Oh, yes.
So,
Okay, venga. Oh.
and if you can't read that behind you, what
yeah.
Gagné is saying is, please can you talk more on how you use your degree for HR management course? I mean, how you use your theology degree for HR management.
Well, you don't necessarily need to use your theology degree to take an HR management course, because this certificate, it has very low requirements. Like if you've done a theology to get into the program, that is. So if you have a bachelor degree in almost anything, you can get into those certificate programs. And they're pretty short. Like the one that I was doing, I think it was 6 courses. I did 1, and just because now I've had this switch in my career, like at first I wanted to become a director of administration. Now I've changed courses. No pun intended. So because of that, I stopped doing the HR management certificate, but I did complete 1 course, and it was amazing. It was great because it really got me thinking in a business sense, right? Because that's something that you're not going to gain in a theology degree, even if you're getting transferable skills. There's a lot of those technical concepts, technical business concepts that you can get by doing a quick 6 continuing education certificate.
All right. Thank you. Any other comments, question? Oh, yes, Jen.
I always feel the need to confess in these situations that I am not a graduate of Concordia, but I have a background in religious studies and theology as well. And one of the things I noticed, really, you were talking like about those transferable skills and talking about transferable skills and writing good cover letters and stuff, is the through line of that I heard was about story, right? And you're telling a story of your career. You're showing how you're telling the story to employers. And I wonder if there's also something particular out of theological studies and out of, and your subtitle is about the Gospels, right? About being in a field that studies story as well, that sort of transfers to that, like telling the story of the work you do.
Oh, that's a great point. I mean, with your question and with Christine's question as well, like it's adding further layers to my understanding of my own story, I guess, right? But absolutely, because I think that, in exegesis and all of that, one of the components you have to consider is the narrative, right? Like the story. What is the story that's being told? Why are they telling that? Are there multiple authors in this story, and all these kinds of things? So absolutely, I think that in my theology degree, but probably even further, my father used to read stories to me all the time, right? So that's another thing that I would say has had an impact. So yes, being immersed in the world of story all the time can definitely play a role in helping you shape your own story to employers. Yeah.
Wow, that's good. Any other comments, questions, reflections? Yes.
Sorry about not being able to come to your presentation right from the beginning, but I've had to get used to living in West Island this past semester, so it takes a while to get here. Gabriel, I wanted to ask you, not knowing what exactly you said at the beginning, I have this friend who studied theology, and he went all the way to the doctoral level, and now he works for the Ministry of Labor of Quebec. And I said, how come? And he said, well, in theology, I was studying texts, like this dry text that we kept talking about, and I'm working with texts there. I'm reading them and helping provide some summaries and stuff to the minister to write legislation. They're of a different nature. Did you have any similar experience? Maybe you spoke about it already. And
Yes. So absolutely. So doing exegesis and interpretation, hermeneutics, all of that, it's definitely helped me with interpreting the law and then being able to draft reports about the law, right? Because in classes, we would do our exegesis and then we'd have to write a paper about it, right? Explain like why our argument about the text is correct, right? And it's the same thing that I do in my work. Is if I'm comparing privacy impact assessments between two different laws, I need to write a report and say, this is my understanding of the differences and the comparisons. Here's why. Let me show you. And the same thing too, if I have to, sometimes I need to look at privacy policies and privacy notices of different companies and stuff like that and do an analysis, right? Like if we're going to have an agreement with them, I need to do an analysis to make sure that it works with what the law says. So all of those skills gained from theology are definitely useful and valuable in the type of work that I do.
Yeah, it's like the synoptic problem, essentially.
That's it.
Comparing, two gospels with Q source or not, or it's very similar. You talked about hermeneutics, which is a good point, because in your thesis, when you were exploring the various perspectives on inerrancy, which is the belief that the Bible contains no errors, you were looking at various viewpoints also of inerrancy. So kind of appreciating the fact that there are different views of inerrancy. That like the tendency, we can have almost like a fundamentalist view of inerrancy and saying, okay, inerrancy is understood by, quote unquote, fundamentalists this way. But what you've uncovered was something more complex, I think, in terms of inerrancy. And that helped you kind of navigate in terms of interpretation that things are not, even in that world, as fixed as we think they are. And that serves also, I imagine, in your navigation of these types of complexities with texts, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Because it's not, with inerrancy, what I learned in my master's research is that it's not clear cut. It's not either you're an inerrantist or you're not. There's a spectrum, right, of people who are hardline inerrantists, and there's people who qualify what inerrancy is. There's people who believe in limited inerrancy. There's people who believe in infallibility, so the Bible won't fail in its mission, and it's inerrant only for those aspects that are concerned with its mission, which is salvific, right? So yeah, I think that has also helped me to take a further complexity when it comes to interpretation, right? Because whenever we're interpreting something, whatever we're interpreting it from our own biases, right? Our own backgrounds. And I think that it's also helped me to recognize my own biases and perhaps even biases of other things that I'm reading in the text. So yeah, it's definitely helpful.
Any other comments, questions? Oh, Ridge.
Hey. Awesome presentation. I'll piggyback a little bit off of, I think, what you were talking about, but you kind of had talked about it more on your personal side of things. And what I'm hearing from your degree in theology is that in some sense, and I don't think it's just specific to theology, but I think theology does it really well, is it allows you to be the center of your research in a sense, in that the questions you're asking are directly related to yourself. They're not just like, oh, I'm doing a report on something that has nothing to do with me. I'm very much implicated. The questions I'm asking are directly related to me. In a sense, I'm able to uncover some things about myself as I'm doing my research. And I wonder if you could talk about if that's true for you, if it was valuable for you in that sense. I don't know if it's just a theology thing, if it's a humanities thing. I haven't done other degrees, but yeah.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I could even see it being applicable in other contexts, like business even. Like it's probably not always the case, and maybe even less so the case. I think theology, people come to study, if you're not studying theology for a religious reason, I think it often is for a personal reason, right? That you probably have some connection to it. You were raised in a religious background, or those questions are important to you, right? So I think because of that, theology often encourages people to do research that's related to their own personal experience. It's not always the case. I've had, fellow theology students studying something, and I knew those people very well, so I couldn't decipher or see how it was connected to them personally. Maybe on some subconscious level that I was unaware of, but whereas there's other people where it's very clear, oh, that's your background, that's what you're studying, oh, that makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense. This is a very personal thing for you. For me, it was. For me, it absolutely was a personal thing. And that's another reason why I will always be glad that I studied theology. I will never look back at my life and think, oh, why didn't I study business? Or even now that I'm working law, why didn't I, study law, I will never think that, because theology was so foundational to me. Coming to study it here was so foundational to my life in getting me to think about things differently, reflect differently, be more open-minded. All of that, they're things that are going to impact me for the rest of my life. I would be a completely different person if I didn't go through that experience. And because of that, yeah, I will just always appreciate the theology degree.
Beautifully put.
Any other comments, questions?
So with your experience in theological studies, just about it being non-confessional and having it come from an academic standpoint, do you think that enrollment of students might be affected to some extent because there might be a conflict with their beliefs and the academic study of theology overall?
That's a really good question. I think it really does depend on the person, right? Sometimes people will come and study here, and it might even encourage them to really go all in on whatever they believe. I've had fellow classmates, they come in as a fundamentalist, they leave as even more of a fundamentalist, right? So it depends on the person. Now, I think it also depends how theology is going to market itself, right? My experience of studying theology is my experience. That's what I experienced. Some people coming to study theology and hearing different voices, different theologies, I think that for them it depends on their experience. So I would say it really depends on how the department markets itself. They can market it in such a way and say that, like, this is something that could happen, right? But we're not trying to make that happen. Like, that's not the goal.
It's more that, I think. I remember when I was studying theology, I have the very similar background, as you know, and you go through this theological shock because you've never heard this stuff before. You would think, oh my goodness, they hid this from me. Why didn't they tell me? That's it. Why didn't they tell me this when I was in my church? And like you kind of react. There's a form of reaction that is negative in a sense. And you said something very interesting because you were at our 50th anniversary 2-3 weeks ago, and there was a question around issues of faith, if you remember. Yeah. And you answered very wisely, I thought, because it is actually the experience of many people in theology that faith is something that fluctuates. that is not necessarily always like, okay, this is faith, 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 faith. It's always like, it's always like static. It doesn't move. It fluctuates. There's times where you doubt more and you have less faith, and there's other times where things, they function well for you. And being in an academic department that focuses on theology will inevitably lead you to these moments of fluctuation, I think. Would you agree with that? Do you feel that that's kind of a bit maybe your experience or even colleagues that you had throughout your academic journey?
Yeah, absolutely. And I stand by what I said there a few weeks ago, that yes, faith is not something that's static, right? So people might have an experience of coming and studying theology, questioning their faith, going through that crisis of faith, but then later on be led back. Like maybe there's an event, a pandemic, for example, or something personal happens in their life that gets them to rethink those questions of God. But coming and studying theology in a non-confessional institution and having gone through that moment of questioning, whatever faith you're left with later on, I would say is a stronger faith. Because now the things that could have been shaken are removed. And now you have that faith that could be stronger.
It's good to know. And I do wonder, though, as well, like in our department, I think it's non-confessional. So I wonder if some people who knew that might be concerned that if they enroll in a non-confessional Department of Theological Studies, they might lose their faith. So I wonder if that might be a problem as well to a certain extent.
Maybe for certain traditions, maybe for some of the more staunch forms of evangelicalism, it's very possible. But it's certainly not the case with all traditions. I think Catholics can come and study theology at Concordia and they won't go through any crisis of faith. I have many friends who are Catholics and never happened to them because these are things they're already exposed to, right? So I would say those who come from a very fundamentalist background, yeah, it's gonna shake you up. Even if it doesn't make you lose your faith or question your faith, go through a crisis of faith, it's definitely going to give you some questions that you may have never thought before. And I think that's a good thing. And Dr. Gagné had also said something that I thought was really great at the theology event a couple weeks ago. And that's that just trying to get the right words to it. Yeah.
Even Mother Teresa is said to have gone through a period where she felt that God was no longer in her life.
Yeah. So you will have those moments of going through those crises of faith, but coming to this non-academic, a non-confessional Department of Theology, it can truly refine that.
It's great.
Can I ask? Gabriel, you alluded to how the department should market itself. Now that you've taken your distance a bit from your degree from us, what advice would you give us? How should we market ourselves?
Well, I think the Humanities Plus is definitely a step in the right direction. And I know that the Department of Theological Studies has been encouraging its students to do certificates, double majors for a long time. And I think that that's something that you should continue to do. And I also know that most people end up coming into theology from another degree, right? They're coming in, they start by studying business, or they start by studying marketing or something like that, but then they decide to switch into theology after coming and trying some of the courses, right? Sarah Thoreau in the marketing video that we have for theology, she says, like, if you come and take one of my courses, I guarantee you're going to come back, right? And that's often what happens, right? So I think that that's That's where a lot of the marketing happens is in the classes, and theology captures a lot of students. I mean, your intro to Christian origins class always gets like 1,000 students, right? And some of the in-person classes get 200-300 students. So that's the moment of marketing, right? That's the moment of like, hey, why don't you come in and do a minor or do a double major? Or, if the person's interested, they'll switch over or maybe even come to the graduate level. That's the moment of marketing, because I think that a lot of students coming to Concordia, if they don't have that personal interest, if they don't have a goal of doing ministry or something like that, theology is not going to be one of their first choices. Like that's the reality. But in the classes, that's the moment of marketing, I think.
All right. Okay. So we're good? Okay. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Thank you so much, Gabriel. This was so insightful. And people got to know you, got to know your journey, got some pointers, I hope. Again, we really appreciate the time that you've taken to talk to us today about your experience. Thank you again for everyone that were here, those online. And we'll have another alumni event probably in the winter. Usually that's what we do. We do two. So again, thank you everyone for attending. All right.
Thank you. Thank you to Gabriel for coming in and for André for facilitating. Thank you for coming into ForSpace today and for activating this conversation. For everyone online and those of you here in the space, thank you for your contributions and your questions as well. We're going to be closing up the Zoom and the live stream now, but just a quick reminder that this conversation is already available on our YouTube channel if you'd like to revisit or share it. So join us again at ForSpace. We've loved having you. Have a